Okay, I'm excited about this series. We are going to look into the prophets and the prophetic tradition in our Bible. And here's what's fun about this is that the need, and we're going to get into this, the need for this is pretty severe because every age and time and period needs prophets. They need people with a voice that will speak out against the system of the day. And so the hope is that you hear this and you're able to run with it and go, I can be that voice in my community, in my family, in my life, whatever that looks like. And that looks like different things to different people. So let's talk first, before that scares you off too much. Every once in a while, Jenna and I will talk about what I'm working on, what the next series looks like. And this one we didn't. So yesterday she asked me, well, what's the new series? And I said, oh, we're going to look through the prophets. Boring. That's what I got. So here's the deal. It's not going to be boring because it's super exciting. These are the cool people of Israel's tradition. These are the greats of our history, of our story. And on top of that, Jesus comes into the picture on the backs, on the heels of these prophets, of this prophetic tradition. So we can do whatever we want and talk about these prophets and how cool, oh yeah, but Bradley, that's the Old Testament. And no, that's not the case. Actually, Jesus comes in, he begins, according to one of the Gospels, he begins his ministry by quoting a prophet and telling them, I am here speaking this voice today. So it's not just some random few guys that are in the Old Testament. It's not just these weird people that did some really, let's be honest, they did some really weird things to get people's attentions and things like that. No, these are the heroes of our story that are speaking truth into the system of power, that are calling people back to God when they've left the tradition. These are the people that remind Israel and us who God is and what God has been doing for us. So this is not boring, okay? So here's what this, okay, before you get too scared off, okay? A prophet is not a fortune teller. And when I say you could be a prophetic voice in your family, in your life, in your community, that doesn't mean tell people what's going to happen. It doesn't mean that you're going to tell people what the end times look like. I made a nice ominous background for this so that we would go, prophets. Anyway, it doesn't mean that. That's not what we're talking about. When we look at the prophets and when we hear about these are people that are simply seeing injustice in the lives of their family, of their community. They are looking at people who have turned God into a system of power sometimes. They've turned religion into a system of control. These are people that are calling us back to our roots. And when Jesus hits the scene, he is doing the same thing. Listen, you've heard that it was said, but I tell you. And he calls us back to our roots in God and learning who that is and what we're supposed to be doing. So this is not boring. And it's not ominous, although that's fun, right? This is exciting stuff, and this is the roots of what we're doing and who we are. So we've been studying in our Thursday nights, our Conversations in Faith, we've been looking through Genesis. And right as we got to the good stuff in Exodus, we paused for the summer, which is fine. That's okay. When I got here, years ago, I had some really cool ideas. I'm going to do some really good messages and good series. And I thought, I'll do the Exodus because it's the foundation of what we're doing. And then I was terribly boring, and it was awful. I know that because I watched it, and it was awful. But here's what's great about this, and this is why we're going to start with Exodus, because we can't miss out on Moses as our quintessential pioneer prophet speaking to us and telling us God's story. So by the time we get to Exodus, we have this short history of Genesis. And some people will tell you that Exodus is the beginning. Some people will tell you that Exodus is this first place, this first story that shapes Israel's history. It shapes the God that we know. It tells a new story about who God is. When you read, we're going to get fun. When you read the Ten Commandments, it begins, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is a foundational story and moment in the people of God, in God's story, in our narrative, in how we tell who God is and how we rethink what we're doing. I say that because sometimes we think about it, this nice, cute little story where God brings these horrendous plagues on people and then drowns a whole bunch of people in the Red Sea. Sometimes we tell that story. But it's not a cute little story. It's great for Sunday school, like all of them. Tell our kids these terrible stories. It's great for Sunday school to tell it like this cute little story, but it's not that. Moses is coming on the scene as a prophet, speaking truth to a system of power. And the story itself unfolds beginning with a story about a powerful people. Everything that they say happens. The gods of Egypt compete in a way that no one can contest. The structure is such that there is pure order in the land. They have tons of quote-unquote peace in their history. And as the story is told, this peace is not peace, but it is control and power and oppression. Oppression is often, still today, is often the means to social order. So here's what we're going to do with this story. We're going to look at what happens and unfolds and how we understand the prophetic tradition beginning with Moses. Let's see, before I forget some of this intro stuff. So systems and power, it's kind of a scary phrase for people, but here's the truth in the matter, is that as we look through our history, and we can look through our own recent history, we don't have to go back 100 years even to look at systems of power and control. But as we look through the story of God, we see oppression first from Egypt and this story of the Exodus. And then we see it, they live in this new order for a few hundred years. And then we see it from the people of God as they ask for a king. They ask to look like all the other nations. What they're asking for is social order that is controlled and that creates power dynamic that they are in control of. Sometimes the danger in these systems and power is not like cultural, it's not otherly. Sometimes it is our own faith and our own religion and our own Christianity or Judaism or whatever religion you are. Sometimes that is the source of this oppressive power dynamic. So we have to be wary of that as we look through this story about prophets. So before we get too far, here are the prophets and what they're doing. So we begin with this story of Exodus and Moses. We are going to move and just touch upon different prophets through the line. But what happens as Israel asks for its own king, they create a social order that demands to be maintained. That is maintained through religion. It's maintained through their own religion. And so throughout the kingdom, they have these very high-ranking officials sometimes. Sometimes they are outsiders that come in. Sometimes they are part of the king's court. These guys are there to tell the king off when he's causing problems. These guys are there to speak up and write that letter and go into the king's court and say, here's the problem with what you're doing right now. Here's where you've missed out on who God is. Here's how you're abusing your power. Here's how you're abusing your people. Here's how you are using God to control. Or here's how you are missing the point. That's what the prophets do. So before you get worried about us talking about the end times, and sometimes they do, but before we get there, these guys are coming in and speaking truth to power, to systems, to people in control. They're speaking truth to oppressive regimes. Those are the prophets. So we have them all the way through. There's not like one period. We have prophets that show up at different periods of time, and they come all the way through. One of the purposes in doing things like this is that I want you to be able to have a broad understanding of what's happening in the text. Like you open it up and go, oh, what is Ruth? I don't know where that is. Where is she? Like, it doesn't make any sense. You're just reading a story, and it could mean anything from anywhere at any time. But when we have the full history of what's going on, we get a picture, we get an image. These things interact with each other and why they're important. Their significance gets played out in where they fall and what's happening at the time period and stuff like that. Okay, so Exodus. Here we go. You ready? I'm going to be less boring than I was the first round through 5 years ago. And we're not going to take like 6 weeks to do Exodus. Although it is a great story and foundational. Did I say that already? So here's what's going on. So we have Genesis. We have all this fun stuff. Abraham has a good time. He teaches us how to look and experience God. He has this family that's set up to do something unique and special and serve all of the other nations of the world. And we see the story of his family down into Joseph. And this is how this transition happens from Genesis to Exodus. If you didn't know any better, you could read Exodus and have no history about Genesis at all. But Joseph is this little transition. Joseph gets sold into slavery. He's taken to Egypt, and he has a fun story. This is what we've been doing on Thursday night. Sorry you missed it. We'll start again in September. So Joseph is here. He gets put in control of the land. And Exodus begins saying, now a king rose up that did not know who Joseph was. Joseph was this great guy. Everything he touched turned to gold like Midas. And the king didn't know Joseph. And he saw this people rising up, getting larger and larger. We would talk about them as the Israelites or the Hebrew people. The people are rising up and getting larger and larger. And in an attempt to control his kingdom, he puts them into a forced slavery. And this is the setting for Exodus. A king forces these people into slavery. And what's interesting about this is if we look at, chapter 2, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field of labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. Everything that they want to do, they have control. Here's this great people, we'll put them into forced labor. It happens. Their gods are respected, their system is understood, and it creates order, and everything that they look to do happens. As Moses comes to age, we're going to skip his birth and all the fun stuff, but as Moses comes to age, the people are more and more frustrated, and for the first time in chapter 2, we get a glimpse of something that's going wrong. And this, you could say, is the first prophetic voice in the book of Exodus. And it's the first time we start to see a crack in the Egyptian framework, in the society. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. So up until then, they've gone through life allowing the system to play itself out. We don't have control. We can't get involved in it. We don't have the power to undo what's happening to us. And they probably, most likely, are appealing to the Egyptian gods in their suffering. And in this moment, when the Egyptian gods are not responding, they risk appealing to a God of freedom, the God of their ancestors, the God who is of the liberating kind. And God hears their voice. And God took notice of them. This is the first sign when God hears that something is going to change. That they have been frustrated, and rather than sitting silent, and rather than letting the system tell them what it's supposed to be and how it's supposed to happen, they cried out to God. Now, in your life, this looks different. You're probably not crying out against a kingdom that has put you in slavery in the physical reality sense, but maybe metaphorically. But you might cry out in a different place. You might cry out in a place of frustration about your workplace, or suffering, or in the midst of struggle. The order, the system ceases to work for you, and you cry out and say, God, hear me. This struggle is not right. Hear my voice. I should not be in this place of suffering. Give me a way out. This is that cry from the Israelites. So in your own life, this looks different, but it's very much there. I should speak for myself. It's very much there in my own life, and I hear it often in yours. How about we could say that? This is the voice at the outset that says, this doesn't work. And Moses is going to be called up by God to speak to these powers, to say, here's what's happening, and it has to stop. So we watch this story of the prophets over and over. But in this moment, we see a system, we see a kingdom that is too powerful to overturn, to undo, to give freedom to these people. So here's what happens as this goes on. Moses gets called. That's a part of a prophet's story. The burning bush, it's fun, it's interesting. You should read it separately. And then Moses says, well, not me. I don't have the voice for this. And God says, well, I'll send your brother Aaron with you. And so his brother and he go to Pharaoh and say, look, you have to stop doing what you're doing. This has to stop. My people need to be free. And here's the fun part of this story. So Moses begins performing magic tricks for him. He throws his staff on the ground and it turns to a snake. But the Egyptian gods, the Egyptian magicians, the Egyptian scientists in research and development, they can match this. They throw their own staffs on the ground that turn into snakes. In fact, even the first few plagues, the water turns to blood on the Nile, the sand rises up and turns into gnats. Even this, the Egyptians come back to Pharaoh and say, we can do that too. This is not special. This is not unique. The system, the gods of the kingdom have the power to match this. This is not something fun just telling you, oh, by the way, we can do this. This is saying, listen, this kingdom, this system is in place, and it has the power to match whatever he's bringing. And so that initial part of the story is the story of a system or a power telling you, no, this is not going to happen. You don't have the power to rise up. We have social order in place for a reason, and it's solid, and you have nothing to combat it with. So we look back into our own history. We can look at slavery only a couple hundred years ago, and we can look at oppressive systems throughout our history and watch people run up against a wall trying to fight to speak truth to power, right? We can watch them get stopped. We can watch things come to an end. We can watch uprisings get squashed with power, with violence, with religion, with everything that they have. But Moses continues to come back, and God continues to display power. And at the end of the day, these magicians, these people that have control over everything, are washed away. At the end of the day, Moses continues to press with his prophetic voice, saying, this needs to end. And God continues to work on behalf of his people. Okay, that's all dark and ominous. I get that. But here's what happens in our real world right now, and what the prophetic voice is all about. We live in a system. And the prophetic voice at any age, at any time, is an alternative voice. And often right now, the church is not an alternative voice. It's part of the system of control. It's part of the system of power. Those are weird terms, but let's talk about what that looks like. Okay, let's talk about money just for a second. Money is told to us by our society that it's going to solve our problems, that it is control, it is power. Money gives us a way to measure ourselves with one another. It gives us a way to control people who we need to control. It gives us a way to create a system of power and control. And on top of all of that, because we're a bit obsessed with it, it gives us our own sort of prison, if you will. We're constantly seeking it. We can't avoid using it and being under the system of salaries and paydays and debt and needing the next car or the next house or the next iPod or whatever it is, right? Money is a form of control that we sort of submit to ourselves on. Society tells us what we need, and we go buy it. Society tells us what we need out of it, and we buy into that story, that narrative. So in this place, the prophetic voice offers an alternative. You don't need what I tell you we need. You don't need the bigger house or the better car or the newer car or the newest iPhone, although I quite like to have it, right? That is part of the system of power and control that we live in, and we can't avoid it. Now, it gets darker than that. That's kind of quite surface level kind of system of power in our own culture. But let me tell you a story about a church. I won't name it. Okay, a lot of the churches are in the South, not of Canada, of the U.S., and will tell you that money represents God's satisfaction with you, and your faith is represented in how God has blessed you. It's not an alternative voice to tell people that. We're already being told that by every commercial ad we see, that money is our blessing and what we've part of our identity. That's not an alternative voice. That is part of the system that is in place that imprisons us in some way, weird way or another. In that case, in that scenario, truth to power is simply speaking, listen, this money has control over you. And you don't need that. And you don't need that much. And you could live without it. And you could do better things with your money. There are, we could have fun. There are starving kids in Africa. There are, people homeless in the streets. All of these things, you could do better things with your money. That's the story we can tell, right? That's the alternative voice. Or simply, you just don't need. But we have a hard time with that statement. And churches are often a part of the system of oppression that money brings us. So that doesn't quite look like a king who's forcing labor upon you. It's a little different than that. But it gets darker, right? We can look into our history. We can look right now into the dynamics of the U.S. and look at racism and the violence that is uprising as we speak. We can look into our own communities and see the treatment of First Nations people. We can look at the way the dynamics work between those in poverty here and those in wealth. We don't have to look far. And each of those need an alternative voice to tell God's story. You see, God hears the cry of our people. And God moves in to take action. And we can be a part of that, or we can sit on the sidelines. There's an interesting, it's not that interesting, but there's a theory of counseling and everything that's called family systems theory. That sounds like a fun term. Family systems theory essentially just says that you operate in a system within your family. There are expectations about how you're going to act. There are expectations about how you are going to behave in a given scenario at Thanksgiving dinner. One of you is supposed to be more talkative. One of you is supposed to sit silently. One of you is supposed to bring up the religious thing of the day, and another politics. There are systems, and those are funny examples, but there is a system of how we act and respond to things in our family. And when you figure out how that system functions and recognize that there is a system there, you have the opportunity to respond differently. If you are supposed to be the youngest sibling that always screws things up, and you now recognize that you're feeding into a family system dynamic that allows your big brother to help you out of a bad situation, or your parents to bring you back into their household, or whatever that is, then you can see what's happening and stop it. Until you recognize that, you play into the system. This is how the prophetic voice operates. The prophetic voice recognizes the system and speaks alternative voice into what's happening. The system in place in Exodus says everything works just as it is. And God brings Moses to the scene to tell them that there is a God of freedom and liberation that will bring you out of your oppression. And here we're talking about a community. But when Jesus gets to turn the page and we see the story of Jesus, Jesus says there is a God of freedom and liberation that is going to bring you out of your oppression. Whatever that looks like. You can be a part of that voice in our community. in your family to tell them, no, I'm not going to scream and shout just because that's what our family system dynamic requires. I'm going to speak love into this situation and allow God to work through me differently. You can tell your friends on Facebook, no, I'm not going to harp on the homeless man with the shopping cart going down the street that's rummaging through my cans in my front yard. Because God has a different voice, and we can free ourselves from this hate and this place of oppression. That's the prophetic word. That's what God gives us in Jesus. That's what God continues to give us through the prophets. You can be different. You can speak love. You can change your own world and those around you through God's voice of freedom and love. So maybe in the end it's a bit ominous. But here's what we're just going to walk through and get pieces of these prophets at different times and different places. And what I love about this is that each of them call us back to our roots. Each of them call us back to God's love so that we can see the world differently. Because it doesn't have to be seen in the system that we're looking through right now. We do have a voice and a place of action to be change, to be love, to be God's grace in the world around us, to make a difference.